The letter arrived on a Tuesday morning in the third week of November, carried by a boy from the village post who did not know what he carried and set it on the hall table as if it were nothing at all. Cecily Ivanov, Countess of Ashvale, stood in the drawing-room doorway when she read it, still wearing her morning gloves, still holding the cup of tea she had carried from the breakfast table and not yet drunk. The words were brief and formal, the kind of words a solicitor chooses when brevity feels kinder than elaboration. Edward Ivanov, Earl of Ashvale, had suffered a fall from his horse on the northern road 3 days prior. The injuries were severe. He had not recovered. Sir Phineas Croft, solicitor to the earldom, expressed his deepest sympathies and would call within the fortnight to discuss the succession of the estate. The teacup did not fall. Cecily set it down on the window ledge with great precision, and the small click of porcelain against stone was the only sound in the room for a long while. She did not cry immediately. The grief arrived the way cold arrives in a room when a fire has gone out, not as a single event, but as a slow withdrawal of warmth from every surface at once. She had been married to Edward for 3 years. She had learned the particular set of his shoulders when he was annoyed with his steward, and the way he cleared his throat before delivering an opinion he suspected she would contest, and the fact that he drank his claret too quickly when his mother was visiting. She had not known, she reflected, with the particular calm of a person in shock, whether any of that amounted to love on his part. She had hoped, quietly and without permitting herself to say so aloud, that it might. Now the question seemed beside the point. She turned from the window. She folded the letter with deliberate care and placed it in the small rosewood box on the writing table, the one she kept locked and kept the key for herself. She put on her outdoor shoes, took her plain gray mantle from the hook in the passage, and went out to see about the tenants. This is the story of what Cecily Ivanov did next, and of how it undid her husband completely. If this kind of story stays with you, consider subscribing so you do not miss the ones that follow. But now, let us go back 3 years to understand what Cecily brought to Ashvale and what Ashvale had done with it. She had come to the Ivanov household through the usual machinery of the season, the third daughter of a minor baronet who had died leaving more good intentions than liquid capital. Her older sisters were settled, if not comfortably. Cecily herself had arrived at her first London ball in a white gown that had been her eldest sister's, retrimmed with new ribbon to disguise its history, wearing her mother's seed pearls because her mother said they photographed beautifully, and then caught herself on the word and laughed. The gown was correct. It was not expensive. Any woman in that ballroom with sufficient attention could have seen the quality of the trimming against the quality of the cloth, and some of them did. And some of them looked away again with the practiced incuriosity of people who have decided a thing is not worth their notice. Edward had not looked away. She had not understood that at first. He was the Earl of Ashvale, which meant that his attention carried a particular social freight, and she had assumed, with the precise practical intelligence she kept carefully obscured in public company, that his attention was part of the evening's social performance rather than its genuine content. He was 29 years old, and by the season's consensus, formidably cold, the kind of man around whom younger debutantes grouped and then rearranged themselves at a careful distance, admiring his profile and mistrusting his silence. He asked her to dance once. He spoke very little during the dance, but what he said was direct and without condescension. And when the music ended, he looked at her in a way she had not known how to interpret and did not permit herself to interpret until considerably later. He called 3 times the following week. His mother, Lady Dorothea Ivanov, the Dowager Countess of Ashvale, called once, and her call was the kind of call designed to measure rather than to greet. She sat in Cecily's mother's small parlor, with the upright posture of a woman who has spent 60 years ensuring that her spine conveyed her opinion of the world before her mouth was required to do so. She looked at the furniture. She looked at the retrimmed gown. She looked at Cecily with the calm, assessing patience of a woman who believes she can read the true contents of any situation. And she said, smoothly and with complete technical politeness, that the Earl had always been susceptible to a pretty face, and that susceptibility in a man of his position required management rather than encouragement. Cecily, who was precisely as intelligent as Lady Dorothea and had been managing her own susceptibilities since the age of 14, said nothing that could be used against her. She poured the tea and asked about Ashvail's autumn hunting, and Lady Dorothea went home, having learned nothing she could deploy. It was the first voicing of a label Cecily would hear in many forms over the following 3 years, the suggestion that she was an opportunist in a pretty gown, a woman who had calculated rather than felt, who had aimed above herself, and who would one day be made to understand the difference between arriving at a great house and belonging to one. Edward proposed in the garden of her mother's rented house on the 4th week of the season, simply and without theatrical embellishment. He said he believed they would suit. She said she believed so too. Neither statement was the whole truth, but both statements were honest as far as they went. And Cecily thought, standing in the narrow garden with the sound of the street beyond the wall and the late May light falling across the stone path, that honesty in its partial form was perhaps the most a person could offer another at this particular junction of their lives. She married him 6 weeks later in the village church at Ashvail, with Nora Greaves, her former governess, and now the estate's housekeeper, standing near the front pew with damp eyes and a handkerchief she had folded into a tidy square. The marriage was not unhappy. That was the precise and careful word for it. It was not unhappy. Edward was not unkind. He was capable of an attention that felt, occasionally, like tenderness, a momentary stillness in his manner when she spoke, a particular care with her comfort in public that she read sometimes as solicitude and sometimes merely as good breeding. What he was not was open. He had his father's face, angular and composed, and he had learned somewhere along the way to keep that face very still in the presence of anything that threatened to move it. Cecily, who had learned her own version of the same lesson, recognized the habit without being able to reach past it. Lady Dorothea continued to visit Ashvail with the regularity of a creditor who has not yet chosen to call in the debt. She was gracious to Cecily in company and economical with her warmth in private, and she said on 4 separate occasions in Cecily's presence, varying the phrasing just enough to avoid the appearance of repetition, that a marriage made in haste during a first season was always vulnerable to the clarity that came with time. The statement was aimed at Cecily. It carried a subtext that Cecily understood perfectly, which was that Lady Dorothea doubted the marriage's foundation and was patient about watching it prove her right. What Lady Dorothea did not know, and what Edward did not know, was what Cecily had brought to Ashvail that was not visible from the drawing-room. She had learned the tenant roles within the first 6 months, not because anyone asked her to, but because the estate's housekeeper, Nora Greaves, had known her since she was 7 years old, and trusted her with the particular frankness that is only possible between 2 women who have seen each other in unglamorous circumstances. Nora told her about the Caro family in the East Cottages, who owed £40 in back rents and had 3 children under the age of 8, and a mother with a cough that had lasted since October. She told her about the schoolroom that had closed when the last governess left, leaving a dozen children with no one to teach them their letters. Cecily listened, and thought, and said nothing to Edward, because she did not yet know how to speak to him about the estate's human interior without it becoming a discussion of her proper sphere. She spent instead, not extravagantly. She reduced her own pin money, trimmed expenses that Lady Dorothea would never have noticed, because Lady Dorothea's attention did not extend to the precise cost of candles or the small economies available at the market in the village. She opened the old still room on the east corridor and used it for 2 hours each morning, 3 days a week, to teach reading to the estate children, 6 of them at first, then 9, then 12, while the autumn term ran and before the cold made the room impractical. Edward did not ask about the still-room hours. He was in London for most of November, and by the time he returned the first snow had closed the road, and Cecily had discovered that she did not know precisely how to tell him about the still-room without it sounding like either an accusation of negligence or a bid for his approval. Into this particular impasse, held for 3 years and not resolved, arrived the letter from Sir Phineas Croft. What Cecily did not know, reading that letter on a Tuesday morning in November, with her tea cooling on the stone ledge, was that her husband was not dead. Edward Ivanov had not fallen from his horse on the northern road. He was, at the moment she read his death notice, sitting in the front room of a factor's cottage 3 miles from the Ashvale boundary wall, alive and in good health, wearing a plain coat and no cravat, waiting to observe what a woman does when she believes herself unwatched and unencumbered. The scheme had been Croft's design technically, and Lady Dorothea's idea originally, proposed over a late autumn dinner at which the Dowager had laid out her case with the measured precision she brought to everything she cared about. She believed, she told her son, that his countess had married him for the earldom. She believed that a woman who came from a minor baronet's diminished household, who arrived at a first ball in a retrimmed gown, who had secured a proposal from the most eligible man in 3 counties within 4 weeks, had done so by calculation rather than feeling. She said she did not say this to wound him, but to protect him and the house. She said that the only reliable test of the truth was observation in conditions of honest grief. Edward had listened. He had told himself he did not believe her. He had gone home and lain awake for 2 nights, turning the question over in the dark, and on the 3rd night he had sent for Croft. Now he was in a factor's cottage, and his wife was settling her household accounts. The first report came from one of the Ashvale footmen, a young man named Peters, who had no idea he was serving as an intelligence agent and was simply answering when Mr. Croft's messenger asked with friendly interest how the household was managing in its grief. Peters reported that the Countess was quiet, that she had not wept publicly, that she had taken no new visitors and refused several calls from the village. Lady Dorothea received this report and interpreted it as evidence of self-possession rather than mourning, which confirmed her view that the marriage had been a transaction, and the transaction was now simply concluded. Edward received the same report and was less certain. The second report came from Nora Greaves, though not voluntarily, and not to Croft's network. Nora did not report to anyone. She simply did her work and kept her own counsel, and watched Cecily with the quiet protectiveness of a woman who had known her since childhood and knew exactly what this grief looked like from the inside. She noted that the Countess rose early each morning and went to the tenant cottages. She noted that the Countess had taken the small cash box from her own writing table, the one she kept locked with the key she always carried, and that the cash box had been considerably lighter when it came back. The third report, the one that sent Edward out into the cold in his plain coat on a gray December morning, came from a boy who had been assigned to watch the east cottages, and who came back to say only that the Countess was inside the Carow house again, and had been there for the better part of an hour. Edward arrived at the east cottages as Cecily was leaving. He had positioned himself at the corner of the old stone wall where the kitchen garden met the lane, behind a stand of bare elder that offered concealment from the path. He told himself he was there to observe objectively. He watched his wife come out of the Carow cottage carrying an empty cloth bag that had evidently been full when she arrived. He watched her stop at the gate to speak with the eldest Carow child, a girl of about 7 who had a red nose and no gloves, and he watched Cecily pull off her own gloves and put them on the child's hands with a matter-of-fact briskness that suggested she had no idea it was worth noticing. He watched her say something that made the child smile. He watched her turn back toward the house with her bare hands folded inside her mantle's front, and her breath visible in the cold air. And he understood. Standing behind the elder branches with the frost on the ground, and the guilt beginning somewhere behind his ribs, that he had not watched a woman performing virtue for an audience. There was no audience. There was only Cecily and a child with cold hands, and his wife had made the only choice available to a person who could not tolerate the alternative. He had stood in that spot for a long time after she disappeared along the path. What Croft had assured him was a test of loyalty had begun, in that moment, to feel like a mirror. And he did not particularly like what the mirror showed. The wound that Lady Dorothea had pressed on when she proposed her scheme was not, as she believed, vanity about his title or his consequence. It was older and quieter than that. His father had been a man whose marriage had been arranged for advantage on both sides, and who had lived inside it with a rigid correctness that passed, at a distance, for dignity and revealed itself, at close quarters, as a lifelong accommodation to mutual indifference. Edward had watched that marriage for 20 years and had formed, without ever stating it to himself clearly, a single private determination that he would not replicate it, that he would choose differently, that whatever he built would be chosen, not acquired. His mother's suggestion, delivered with such precision at that autumn dinner, had struck him not because it was certainly true, but because it was possibly true. And he had not, in 3 years of marriage, been certain enough of himself to dismiss it. He had offered Cecily a great house and a title and an income, and she had accepted. And he had called that choice reasonable and perhaps more than reasonable. And beneath that reasoning, he had kept a small, unexamined fear that he had replicated his father's mistake exactly, only with a prettier face across the table. The Carrow cottage had not resolved that fear. It had dissolved it. And the dissolution left him standing in the cold, with nothing but the understanding that he had staged his own death to test a woman who had spent the mourning period giving away her last pin money to a sick family, and that this understanding was going to require something from him that he had not previously been asked to pay. Lady Dorothea arrived at Ashvale in the 3rd week of December, nominally to assist with the estate's transition, and practically to ensure that the transition moved in the direction she had in mind. She brought her personal maid and 2 boxes of correspondence, and her own particular atmosphere of settled authority. And she took the blue drawing room as her base of operations, with the calm efficiency of a general who has surveyed the terrain in advance. She told Cecily, on the evening of her arrival, over a dinner at which both women maintained careful manners, that the winter ball was a tradition of the earldom and ought not to be abandoned simply because the earl was gone, that the estate's neighbors and tenants expected it, and that Cecily, as the outgoing countess, would naturally preside at it with appropriate dignity. Cecily understood what outgoing meant. She said she was happy to assist in any way required. She said it quietly, and without any perceptible change in her expression. And Lady Dorothea heard the answer she expected to hear. She did not hear the edge beneath it, the particular quality in Cecily's voice that Nora Greaves, seated at the far end of the servants' passage, would have recognized immediately as the sound of a woman who has decided not to show her hand. The winter ball took place on the 22nd of December, and Ashvale was dressed for it with the candles and the hothouse greenery and the particular formality that the estate could produce when it needed to. The neighbors came, 43 of them, and the local clergy, and Sir Phineas Croft, who arrived early and positioned himself near the far door with the slightly wooden posture of a man who is waiting for an event he has been complicit in producing. Nora Greaves managed the household with her customary composed authority, moving between kitchen and ballroom with a face that gave nothing away and eyes that noted everything. Cecily appeared at the top of the stairs at 7 o'clock in a gown of dark gray silk, not mourning cloth precisely, but respectful of mourning, with her mother's seed pearls at her throat, and her hair dressed plainly. She looked, Lady Dorothea thought from her position near the fireplace, composed and slightly diminished, exactly as she should look. A woman preparing to withdraw gracefully. The evening ran its first hour in the usual pattern of Regency social assembly, with the particular warmth of neighbors who have known one another long enough to be honest, and the particular careful politeness of those who understood that the hostess was a widow, and the occasion had an undertone. Cecily moved through the rooms and spoke to people she knew, and poured out the ritual courtesies of the evening with the same practical competence she brought to everything she found worth doing. At 8:30, Lady Dorothea called the room to attention. She did it with the skill of a woman who had been calling rooms to attention for 40 years, a raised hand, a particular quality of stillness that spread through the nearest group and then the next, until the music stopped, and 43 faces turned toward her. She stood at the head of the room with the Ashvale candelabra behind her, and she looked at Cecily across the space between them. And she said, in a voice pitched to carry without appearing to be raised, that she had something to tell the company that she knew would be difficult to hear. She said that the Earl of Ashvale had not, in fact, died. The sound that moved through the room was not a gasp precisely. It was a collective held breath, the kind that precedes either a cheer or a question. Lady Dorothea continued before either could form. She said that her son had arranged, with the assistance of his solicitor, to stage his passing in order to establish certain truths about his marriage. She said that the results of the period of observation had been instructive. She said that she had advised the scheme, and that she believed the scheme had achieved its object, which was to confirm that the Countess of Ashvale had not formed a genuine attachment to the man she married. She said precisely, and with the full weight of 40 years of social assurance, that a woman who spent a mourning period on tenant cottages and schoolroom hours rather than genuine grief had demonstrated something about the quality of her feeling. The room was very still. Cecily stood at the far end of it, with the seed pearls at her throat, and her hands folded in front of her, and she did not move for a long moment. The heat of 43 pairs of eyes was a specific physical sensation, the kind that other women in other circumstances might have fled from or dissolved under. She felt it, and did not move. And then she spoke. She said that Lady Dorothea was correct that she had visited the tenant cottages during the mourning period. She said she had done so because the Carow family owed £40 in back rents, and Mrs. Carow had a cough that had been worsening since October, and because the estate children had had no one to teach them their letters for the better part of a year, and because she was the Countess of Ashvale, and those were her people, and she did not know any other way to grieve than to look after what she had been given to look after. She paused. The room remained still. She said she was not going to speak about her husband's choice to test her, because that choice was between them and not between her and the assembled company. She said she had one thing to say plainly, for the record of anyone who cared to hear it. She said that she had not married the Earl of Ashvale. She had married Edward, and she had spent 3 years trying to know him. And she was sorry that he had not felt in those 3 years that she was worth the corresponding effort. She stopped. She did not look away from Lady Dorothea. She did not look away from anyone. Nora Greaves, standing at the edge of the room near the passage door, saw the room shift in the way that rooms shift when a true thing has been said in a place that expected a performance. Several of the neighbors looked at their shoes. Sir Phineas Croft looked at the door he was standing near. Lady Dorothea opened her mouth to continue, and she found that the sentence she had prepared was no longer the right sentence for the room she was standing in, and she closed it again. The door at the far end of the ballroom opened. Edward Ivanhoe, Earl of Ashvale, stood in the doorway without his evening coat, in his plain, dark travel coat, with the dust of the road still on the hem, and he looked across the full length of the room at his wife. He did not look at his mother. He did not look at Croft. He looked at Cecily with the expression of a man who has arrived too late at something he should have prevented and knows it. He crossed the ballroom floor. It was not a dramatic crossing in the theatrical sense. It was simply a man walking toward the only person in a crowded room who mattered, with 43 witnesses arranged around them like the walls of a trial chamber. The distance was perhaps 30 feet, and he covered it without hurrying and without looking anywhere else, and the crowd parted the way crowds part when they have already decided the outcome and are simply waiting for it to be made official. He stopped in front of Cecily. He was close enough that she could see the cold still on his face from the road and the particular set of his jaw that she had spent 3 years learning. He said her name. Not her title. Not the formal address. He said Cecily. And the word was short and unadorned, and carried everything he could not arrange into proper sentences. She looked at him. She did not look at the room. He said he had been wrong, and that he had known it since the morning he stood behind the elder hedge at the East Cottages and watched her give away her gloves to a child who needed them more, and that being wrong about a person one loves is a particular kind of shame he intended to earn his way out of, if she would allow him the opportunity. He said that was not a request made to the company assembled. It was a question asked of her, in front of them, because she deserved to have the question asked in the same room where the wrong had been done. He waited. The seed pearls at Cecily's throat moved once, a single visible breath, and then she was still again. And the calculation behind her eyes was not the cold calculation of a woman who married for advantage. It was the precise and honest reckoning of a woman deciding whether to trust the only thing she had spent 3 years hoping for. She said yes. She said it without theatrical accompaniment, simply and in the way she said everything that mattered. And the word landed in the room's silence with the weight of something final. Nora Greaves, at the edge of the crowd, made a sound that was not quite a word and pressed her handkerchief to her mouth. Several of the neighbors began, cautiously, to breathe. Lady Dorothea sat down on the nearest chair with the careful deliberateness of a woman who has understood something she should have understood considerably earlier. She did not speak. She did not need to. The room's realignment had passed through her like a correction she could feel in her spine. Not a humiliation exactly, but a revision. The kind that comes when one has been completely certain and has discovered that certainty is not the same as accuracy. It was, for a woman of her particular architecture, enough. Croft, near the door, moved to stand beside it in case anyone required it opened. Nobody did. Nora spoke once, when the room's hum had begun to resume around the edges. She spoke to the neighbor nearest her, a Mrs. Fentham of the adjoining estate, in a voice not intended to carry, but carrying nonetheless. She said that she had watched the Countess spend the last month of her marriage portion on the Carow family's debt, and on candles for the schoolroom, and that she had done it every morning before the household was properly awake, and that she would like Mrs. Fentham to know that, in her opinion, there was not a woman in the county who had done better by an estate that had not done particularly well by her. Mrs. Fentham, who was 60 years old and had seen several winters of Ashvale, and had privately thought for 3 years that the Countess was wasted on the arrangement, nodded with considerable feeling. The winter ball continued for another 2 hours, because Regency social gatherings do not collapse gracefully under the weight of revelation, and the supper had been prepared, and it would have been wasteful to send it back. Edward stayed at Cecily's side for the remainder of the evening, with the kind of proximity that had previously characterized their public appearances only in the most formal ceremonial sense, and this time it was not ceremony. Cecily spoke to the neighbors she had been speaking to before the interruption, and answered their questions with her customary plainness, and accepted their expressions of goodwill with the grace of a woman who is not entirely accustomed to goodwill and finds it requires careful management. They did not speak to each other at length that night. There was too much else to do, and too many people, and some things require more quiet than a winter ball provides. But once, near the end of the evening, when the supper had been laid, and the musicians had moved to a slower melody, and the candles had burned lower, and the room had settled into the comfortable second act of a long gathering, Edward touched her hand briefly. Not a gesture for the room's benefit. A small private action, his fingers closing once around hers and then releasing. The way a person confirms that something is real before they allow themselves to believe in it. She did not look at him. She did not need to. They left the ballroom together when the last guests had gone, and Nora moved efficiently through the rooms overseeing the clearing of the supper tables, and the house settled around them into the particular quiet of a December night, when the fire has been banked and the candles are being snuffed one by one in the upper rooms. Cecily went to the library. It was where she had spent most of the morning period's evenings, partly because the library fire was the warmest in the house, and partly because the library was the room in Ashvale that felt most genuinely inhabited, its shelves disordered enough to suggest actual use, and its chairs angled toward the fire in the particular arrangement of a person who reads for pleasure rather than for display. On the first night after the letter arrived, she had come into the library and found the marriage portrait still hanging in its usual place above the writing table. A competent oil of the two of them commissioned in the first autumn of their marriage, and she had stood looking at it for a long time before she turned it to face the wall, because she could not decide whether looking at it was honest or simply painful, and she chose the version that required less maintenance. She had turned it back 3 days ago. She had not been certain why. She had told herself it was because the room looked strange without it. But the real reason, which she had not permitted herself to examine in full, was that she had found she could not stop looking at him, even in paint, and that this quality of attention was its own answer to a question she had not been asked. The portrait faced outward now, its familiar composition of 2 young people in formal dress, the woman in white and the man with his mother's jaw and his own careful eyes. It hung above the writing table where it had always hung, in the room where the fire was still burning and the snow had begun outside the window, falling without urgency past the dark glass. Edward came in behind her. He stood in the doorway for a moment, looking at the portrait, and then at her, and she turned from the window and looked at him across the firelit room with her plain gray silk and her mother's pearls, and the particular quality she had always had of being entirely present in whatever space she occupied. No performance, no defense, simply herself. He crossed the library in 3 steps and stood before her, and said, more quietly than anything he had said in the ballroom, that he was sorry. He said he had spent 3 years in possession of something he did not deserve because he had not trusted it enough to look at it directly. He said his father's marriage had taught him the wrong lesson, or rather, he had learned from it the fear of replication rather than the possibility of something different. And he had let that fear make a coward of him in the particular way that men of intelligence sometimes do, by constructing the test rather than simply asking the question. He said he was asking the question now. He said, did she still want this, meaning the marriage and the house and the imperfect man inside both of them? And he said it with the directness of someone who had decided that the worst answer was better than no answer at all. Cecily looked at the fire for a moment. She looked at the portrait. She looked at him. She said she had wanted this for 3 years and had not known how to say so without sounding like something she was not, which was a person who wanted to be wanted rather than a person who simply wanted. She said there was a difference, and she had been afraid he would not understand it. She said she thought he probably understood it now. He did. The fire in the library burned through the night, and the snow fell past the window with the patience of a thing that has nowhere else to be, and the portrait of the two of them hung above the writing table in the room that was theirs. By the following morning, the Caro family's debt was formally settled, not from Cecily's marriage portion, which had spent itself honestly, but from the estate accounts where it had always should have been settled, and Nora Greaves told the footman Peters with considerable satisfaction that the Caro children would be warm enough to attend the schoolroom after Christmas, and Peters, who had been conducting his informal intelligence work without knowing what it served, said he was very glad to hear it, and meant it. The schoolroom opened again in January, in the old still room on the East Corridor, with 12 children and 1 former governess who had waited 3 years to be asked to do properly what she had been doing informally. Nora managed it with the brisk authority she brought to every undertaking, and refused the title of schoolmistress on the grounds that it sounded too permanent for a woman who still had a household to run. She accepted the title after a fortnight because the alternative was leaving the paperwork unsigned, and Nora was not a woman who left paperwork unsigned. Edward sat in the library one evening in late January with the fire burning and the snow still at the window, which had been a reliable feature of that particular winter, and Cecily was reading in the chair opposite and not looking at him, and he thought about what it had cost her to stand in the ballroom and say the true thing plainly in front of 43 people who had been arranged to witness her diminishment instead. He thought about the elder hedge at the East Cottages, and the child with the cold hands and the empty cloth bag, and he thought about the portrait she had turned back to the wall and then turned outward again before he came home. He thought that there were several kinds of loyalty, and that the kind he had tested for was the least interesting of them. He said none of this aloud. He was still learning the language required for it, and Cecily was patient with the learning in the same way she was patient with everything, steadily and without comment, simply continuing to inhabit the same room with him, and to be, in that room, entirely herself. That was enough. For the time being, it was more than enough. The marriage portrait hung above the writing table in the library for the rest of that winter and into the following spring, and past it, and the 2 figures in it looked much as they had always looked, a woman in white and a man with careful eyes, the composition unchanged. What had changed was the room that held it, and the 2 people who sat beneath it in the firelight, and the quiet, ongoing quality of what passed between them. Outside, the snow fell and then stopped, and then the winter slowly, reluctantly withdrew. If Cecily's story moved you, leave a comment with the moment that stayed with you longest. More stories like this one are here when you need them.